The night still smelled of perfume and spilled champagne. Andrew Weston pushed open the glass doors of the luxury hotel with the air of a man who believed the city still belonged to him. The hour was past 3 in the morning, but Andrew didn't care. He had a beautiful woman on his arm, laughter still spilling from her lips. Hila Carter, the 25-year-old influencer who thrived on flashing cameras, clung to him as if she were the crown jewel of his empire. To Andrew, it was intoxicating. To Hila, it was opportunity. They stumbled out into the cold Manhattan air, the doorman forcing a polite smile even as he judged the scene. Andrew pulled his coat tighter and flagged down a waiting town car. For years he had been accustomed to limousines and paparazzi snapping his every move. Tonight was no different, or so he thought. He grinned when the flash of cameras lit up the sidewalk. "Let them see," he whispered into Hila's ear. "The world should know who runs this city." But beneath that bravado, something ugly festered. He was reckless. His business was strained, his investors restless, his accounts stretched thin. Yet Andrew refused to let anyone see the cracks. Tonight, he wanted to believe he was still untouchable. As the cameras clicked, a journalist shouted from the curb, "Andrew, does your wife know where you've been tonight?" The question sliced through the cold air. Andrew's jaw tightened, but he forced a smirk. "Ex-wife," he corrected, emphasizing the word as though it set him free. The reporters leaned closer, scribbling, recording, waiting for the soundbite. Hila pressed her cheek against his shoulder and laughed loud enough for every microphone to capture. The car ride was a blur of neon lights streaking past the tinted windows. Andrew poured champagne from the minibar, raising a toast to the reflection of himself in the glass. "To new beginnings," he declared. Hila giggled, but her eyes flickered toward the phone buzzing in her lap. She angled the screen away from him, typing quickly, her nails clicking like tiny daggers. Andrew didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the illusion of victory. By dawn, Andrew awoke in the penthouse he had rented for the night. His head ached from alcohol, but his smile returned when he saw Hila draped across silk sheets. He rolled over, reaching for his phone to check the time. The first notification made him pause. His credit card company had flagged suspicious activity. Tens of thousands spent overnight, wired to accounts he didn't recognize. His stomach twisted. "Hila," he muttered, shaking her shoulder. She stirred lazily, stretching like a cat. "Where's my wallet?" She sat up, her hair falling in deliberate waves. "Oh, Andrew, don't be so dramatic. I borrowed it. We'll settle later." "Borrowed?" His voice sharpened. He stumbled to the closet where his jacket had been tossed. The pocket was empty. Panic flickered across his face. "Where is it?" Hila yawned. "Relax. You can afford it, can't you? Or maybe you can't." Her tone was mocking now, her smile cruel. Andrew's hands trembled as he opened his banking app. The balance stared back at him like a death sentence. Half his liquidity, gone. He whirled around, but Hila was already slipping out of bed, her phone in hand, her heels clicking across the marble floor. "Wait, where are you going?" "Breakfast. With someone who actually knows how to treat me," she tossed over her shoulder. And then, with one final smirk, she left the penthouse door swinging behind her. Andrew collapsed into a chair, sweat beading at his temples. The night of indulgence had turned into a financial ambush. He had been played. He buried his face in his hands, his mind racing. The media had already caught them together. By morning, headlines would scream his betrayal, his recklessness. If the financial hole became public too, his investors would flee, his empire would crumble. His phone buzzed again. A message from his assistant. "Call me immediately." Urgent, board members demanding answers. Andrew's world tilted. He had believed he was untouchable. Now, after a single night with his mistress, he was bleeding money, reputation, and control. He slammed his fist against the table, rage and fear colliding in his chest. Yet even as he tried to gather the pieces, another thought crept in, cold and venomous. His ex-wife, Emma. He hadn't seen her in months, not since the divorce papers had been finalized. The last memory he carried was of her standing in the rain, clutching her swollen belly, begging him not to leave. He had walked away without looking back. He had told himself she would never survive without him, that she would crawl back. But as the first morning light pierced through the curtains, Andrew realized something terrifying. If Emma resurfaced now, if she dared to appear stronger than he imagined, the world would not only judge him for infidelity. They would watch him burn. He poured another glass of champagne with shaking hands, though the taste now felt like acid. He told himself Emma was gone, that she was too weak, too broken. Yet a whisper at the back of his mind kept repeating, "What if she returns?" He turned on the television for distraction. The morning news flashed across the screen, and his heart stopped. There she was, Emma Weston, walking into a building beside a man he recognized instantly. Ethan Blackwell, the billionaire CEO who could crush fortunes with a single boardroom vote. Cameras swarmed as Emma entered, her face calm, her hand resting gently over the curve of her dress. She was no longer the abandoned wife. She was a force. Andrew's glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the marble floor. He stared at the screen, breathless, his empire collapsing around him. And then came the final blow. The anchor's voice announcing that Emma Weston would be attending the Bright Horizons Gala that very night, standing beside Ethan Blackwell. Andrew gripped the armrest, fury battling fear. This was no coincidence. It was war. But he had no idea just how merciless Emma's return would be. Emma Weston sat by the window of her modest apartment, the morning sun casting pale light across the worn wooden floor. She had woken early, not because she wanted to, but because her life no longer allowed the luxury of sleeping in. At 32, Emma's days were filled with duties that stretched far beyond her years. She was both mother and father, both protector and provider. And though her face still carried the softness of youth, her eyes had learned the weight of betrayal. Once, Emma had believed in fairy tales. She had fallen in love with Andrew Weston, a man who walked into her life with the charm of a dream and the promise of a lifetime. Back then she was still Emma Collins, the young architect, brimming with ambition. She had been working late nights at a small design firm in Brooklyn, chasing deadlines and sketching towers that might one day scrape the sky. Andrew had strolled into her office with a smile too polished and words too smooth. He was already climbing the corporate ladder, already making headlines as the man who could turn stone into gold. For Emma, it wasn't the wealth that captivated her. It was the way he seemed to look at her, as though she were more than just another woman struggling in the city. He made her laugh, made her feel seen. Within a year, she was Mrs. Andrew Weston. Within 2, she had traded her drafting table for charity luncheons, her hard hat for designer gowns. She told herself she didn't mind. She told herself she was supporting him, that building their family was more important than any skyscraper she could design. But behind the glittering surface of their marriage, cracks formed. Andrew grew restless. The charm that once warmed her turned cold. His ambition, once inspiring, became ruthless. By the time Emma discovered she was pregnant, Andrew was already slipping away, his eyes chasing other women, his phone always buzzing with messages he never let her see. She begged him to be present, to care, to remember the vows they had made. Instead, he sneered at her, calling her naive, weak, unworthy of the life he had given her. The final blow came one stormy night. She was 6 months pregnant, standing in their penthouse foyer with rain dripping from her hair. Andrew had returned from another business trip, the scent of perfume clinging to him like a cruel truth. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He simply walked past her, suitcase in hand, muttering that he deserved more than a whining wife and a swollen belly. And then he left. He didn't look back. Emma remembered standing there, heartbreaking, one hand cradling her stomach, whispering to the child inside, "We will survive this. I promise." And survive she did. The divorce was brutal. Andrew's lawyers tore at her like wolves, painting her as a fragile, dependent woman who couldn't survive without his fortune. She lost the penthouse, the cars, the accounts. She left with little more than her unborn child and a small settlement barely enough to cover rent in a modest apartment. The world whispered behind her back, "Poor Emma. She'll beg to come back. She'll never manage on her own." But those whispers became fuel. Emma threw herself into rebuilding. She returned to architecture, freelancing for small firms, taking projects nobody else wanted. She worked late into the night, baby monitor by her side, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Some nights she wept quietly, terrified she would fail. Yet every morning, she rose again. Slowly, opportunities came. Her designs, once dismissed, began drawing attention. Her ability to create spaces that breathed warmth and humanity in a city obsessed with glass and steel made her unique. Within 3 years, she had launched her own boutique design company. Investors noticed. Contracts followed. Emma Weston became a name whispered not as pity, but as respect. Still, she stayed out of the spotlight. She wasn't ready to face the glittering world that had once cheered her husband while ignoring her tears. She focused on her daughter, Lily, who had become her reason for every breath. Lily's laughter filled the apartment, her tiny footsteps a melody of hope. When clients praised Emma's designs, she always said the same thing. Everything I build is for her. But Emma also knew that the world of men like Andrew never truly went away. Rumors of his affairs spread across tabloids. Pictures of him with Yila Carter made headlines. Emma tried to ignore them, telling herself he was no longer her concern. Yet a part of her still burned with the memory of being discarded, humiliated, erased. The call from Ethan Blackwell changed everything. Ethan had been a distant figure from her past, a billionaire CEO whose path had crossed hers during her early marriage. He had attended charity galas, spoken briefly with her about architecture, and left an impression of quiet strength. When he reached out, Emma assumed it was for business. But his words startled her. "Emma, I know what Andrew has done, and I know you're stronger than he ever believed. I have an opportunity, if you're ready." The opportunity was more than business. Ethan wanted Emma to join a major project, an urban renewal initiative that would reshape part of Manhattan. It would put her company on the map permanently, cementing her reputation. But more than that, he offered something Andrew never had: respect. Emma hesitated at first. She feared the attention, feared being dragged back into the limelight where whispers could cut her open again. But when Ethan mentioned the Bright Horizons Gala, her heart stopped. He wanted her to attend as his partner in the project, to be introduced publicly. Emma stared at the invitation for a long time that night. It shimmered under the lamp, heavy with meaning. She thought of Andrew's mocking laughter, of the day he called her worthless. She thought of Lily, asleep in the next room, dreaming innocent dreams. And she thought of the woman she had become, not broken, not begging, but building a future stone by stone. By the time dawn touched the sky, Emma made her decision. She would attend. Not to flaunt, not to wound, but to reclaim her place in the world. The day of the gala arrived. Emma stood before the mirror, her reflection framed in soft gold light. Gone was the timid wife who hid behind second-hand dresses. Tonight she wore a gown of deep emerald silk, tailored perfectly to her form. Her hair was swept into a graceful knot, her eyes lined with quiet fire. She looked at herself, not with vanity, but with recognition. "This is who you were meant to be," she whispered. Her phone buzzed. "A message from Ethan. The car is waiting. Are you ready?" Emma's heart raced, but her voice was steady as she answered, "Yes." She kissed Lily on the forehead, leaving her in the care of a trusted friend. Then she stepped out of the apartment, heels clicking against the pavement, carrying not just herself, but every promise she had ever made to her child. The city seemed to hold its breath as she slid into the waiting car. Tonight, she would walk into the same world that once broke her. And she would not bend. And when Andrew saw her again, he would realize that the woman he discarded had become the woman who could destroy him. The city glowed like a jewel that evening, every skyscraper window a shard of light against the velvet night. But inside the Bright Horizons Gala, the glow was almost blinding. The ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel had been transformed into a kingdom of wealth and vanity. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Tables glimmered with golden place settings, each centerpiece an explosion of roses and orchids flown in from Ecuador that morning. The air buzzed with the hum of violins and the clink of champagne flutes, while photographers prowled like wolves at the edges of the crowd. It was the event of the year. The city's elite had come in droves. Tycoons, politicians, heirs of dynasties, faces that could make stock markets rise or fall with a whisper. They were dressed in gowns shimmering with sequins, tuxedos sharper than knives, diamonds that glittered like galaxies. This wasn't just a fundraiser for children's education. It was the battlefield of reputation, the arena where fortunes paraded themselves. Andrew Weston stepped into the ballroom with the same arrogance he had carried the night before. His tuxedo was custom-made, his shoes polished to a mirror sheen. On his arm, Ela Carter preened in a dress of scarlet silk cut dangerously low, her every step designed to be captured by cameras. They looked, to the untrained eye, like royalty. But Andrew's smile was tighter than usual, the muscles of his jaw straining against the pressure building inside him. He needed tonight to work. He needed to remind the city that he was still a king, still untouchable. Already whispers swirled about his reckless spending, about the money siphoned away. He pretended not to hear. If he could dazzle investors tonight, he might still salvage his empire. Across the room, Emma Weston arrived with Ethan Blackwell. The doors seemed to sigh open as they entered. Emma's emerald gown caught the light like liquid fire, every step a quiet declaration. Her posture was regal, her chin lifted, her expression calm but unyielding. Ethan walked beside her, tall, commanding, dressed in a midnight suit that radiated understated power. He was the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than Andrew's loudest boast. The moment Emma appeared, the air shifted. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and the first flashes of cameras erupted like a storm. Guests whispered furiously. "Wasn't that Andrew's ex-wife? Who is she with? Why does she look so different?" Emma felt every gaze, but she didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks. The moment she would no longer be pitied, no longer invisible. She wasn't here to blend in, she was here to rise. At the center of the ballroom, Andrew froze. His glass of champagne nearly slipped from his hand when his eyes locked on Emma. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. She wasn't the fragile woman he had discarded. She wasn't the rain-soaked figure begging him to stay. She was radiant, powerful, untouchable. And worst of all, she was beside Ethan Blackwell. Ela tugged at his sleeve, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. "Smile for the cameras," she hissed, posing perfectly for a photograph. Andrew forced his lips into a grin, but his eyes never left Emma. Ethan leaned slightly toward Emma as the crowd parted before them. "You're handling this well," he murmured. Emma's lips curved into a small, steady smile. "I'm not here to handle, I'm here to show him I'm not afraid." As they moved deeper into the ballroom, Emma could feel the energy intensify. Investors who had once dismissed her now stared with new respect. Society women whispered to one another behind jeweled fans. Even the orchestra seemed to stumble for a moment before regaining its rhythm. The sight of Andrew's discarded wife walking confidently with a billionaire was a scandal too delicious to ignore. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his voice booming over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bright Horizons Gala. Tonight we gather not only to celebrate generosity, but to recognize those who shaped the very future of our city." Applause thundered. Waiters glided between tables with silver trays of caviar and champagne. Yet beneath the glitter, the tension thickened. Andrew's facade began to crack as more and more eyes drifted from him to Emma. The spotlight he craved was no longer his. At one table, a group of investors murmured, "Is that Ethan Blackwell's date? That's Weston's ex-wife, isn't it?" Another voice replied, "If Ethan's backing her, maybe we've been underestimating her all along." Andrew clenched his fists under the tablecloth. He had spent years convincing the world Emma was weak, incapable, forgettable. And now, before his very eyes, she was rewriting the narrative. Emma took her seat beside Ethan near the front of the stage. As she settled, she caught Andrew's gaze across the room. For a split second, silence roared between them. His glare was laced with fury, hers with calm defiance. She didn't look away. The gala continued. Speeches, performances, a dazzling silent auction, but every moment seemed to orbit around the unspoken drama unfolding in the room. Emma's composure drew admiration. Andrew's forced laughter drew suspicion. Ela, sensing the shift, grew restless, her attempts at attention falling flat. As dessert was served, the tension reached a breaking point. The MC announced, "Tonight, we are honored to introduce a new partner in our education initiative, a leader whose vision promises to transform the landscape of this city." Ethan rose, buttoning his suit jacket with effortless authority. "Thank you," he began, his deep voice echoing across the room. "I've always believed that progress begins with opportunity. And tonight, I want to introduce the architect behind our new urban renewal project, Emma Weston." Gasps erupted. Cameras exploded. All eyes turned to her. Emma stood slowly, her gown shimmering under the spotlight. She walked to the stage, each step steady, deliberate. She accepted the microphone, her hand firm, her voice clear. For too long, I was told I wasn't enough, that my place was in the shadow of someone else's ambition. Tonight, I stand not in shadow, but in purpose. We will build schools, homes, and futures that last, not just for the privileged, but for every child who deserves a chance. The room erupted in applause, some standing, some still whispering in shock. Emma's words had struck a chord deeper than glamour could reach. At his table, Andrew sat rigid, his face pale, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. Hila leaned closer, her smile faltering. "Andrew, people are looking at her, not you." His glass shattered in his hand, the sound swallowed by the roar of applause. And across the stage, Emma met his eyes once more, unflinching. Because for the first time, the power in the room belonged to her. Andrew Weston had always believed appearances could save him. For years, he had polished the perfect smile, the powerful handshake, the practiced laugh that charmed investors and silenced doubt. But tonight, inside the glittering Bright Horizons gala, his armor was cracking. He felt it in the way eyes no longer lingered on him, but drifted, inexorably, to the stage where Emma now stood. He felt it in the whispers that pricked like needles against his skin. And he hated it. Hila Carter clung to his arm like a glittering ornament, her scarlet dress daring, her smile wide enough to blind. But Andrew knew she was watching the room too, calculating, measuring. He could feel her nails pressing lightly into his sleeve, a silent reminder that her loyalty had limits. "Relax," she whispered through her perfect teeth as the applause thundered for Emma. "You still have money, you still have power. They'll forget her by morning." Andrew's jaw tightened. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low. "This isn't supposed to happen. She's not supposed to be here. She's not supposed to be anything." But Hila had heard enough. She tilted her head, eyes flashing with amusement. "Funny, because from where I'm sitting, your ex-wife just stole the room." The words were a dagger. Andrew swallowed hard, fury coiling inside him. He forced himself to laugh, loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "My ex-wife," he said, raising his glass, "is enjoying her 5 minutes of fame. Let her have it. By tomorrow she'll be forgotten again." The men at his table chuckled politely, but their eyes betrayed doubt. One of them, a venture capitalist Andrew desperately needed to impress, leaned closer. "Ethan Blackwell doesn't lend his name lightly. If he's backing her, she's not just a passing story." Andrew's smile froze. Hila saw the color drain from his face and smirked. She leaned close, whispering so only he could hear. "If she's rising, Andrew, maybe you should have treated her better. She might have been your greatest asset." His hand tightened around his glass until the stem cracked. He wanted to shout, to remind Hila she was nothing more than a pretty distraction, but he bit back the words. "Not here. Not yet." Across the room, Emma returned to her seat beside Ethan, calm and composed, every inch the opposite of Andrew's unraveling facade. He couldn't tear his eyes from her. Once, she had begged for his love. Now she commanded the respect of everyone in the room. "Andrew," Hila cooed suddenly, breaking his trance. "Smile. Cameras are still watching." She adjusted her neckline, ensuring the photographers captured every angle of her body. But the cameras weren't on her. They weren't even on Andrew. They were locked on Emma, whose quiet strength was worth more than Hila's glittering spectacle. Hila noticed, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of unease. Later in the evening, as guests drifted toward the dance floor, Andrew pulled Hila aside, his grip tight on her wrist. "You're going to behave tonight?" he hissed. "No more comments about Emma. No more comparisons." Hila yanked her wrist free, her eyes narrowing. "Don't bark at me like I'm your dog. I'm not the one losing control here. You are. And if you think I'll sit quietly while you implode, you're wrong." Andrew's face darkened. "You need me." Her laughter was sharp, almost cruel. "Do I? Or do you need me, Andrew? Because from what I hear, your accounts are bleeding. Rumors say you've lost millions. If that's true, then maybe I should be looking for a better seat at the table." The words hit like gunfire. For a moment, Andrew couldn't breathe. Rage boiled, but underneath it, fear gnawed at him. She knew. Somehow, she knew. "Careful," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't forget who brought you here." Hila smiled sweetly, but her eyes glinted with defiance. "And don't forget, darling, who can ruin you faster than anyone else. The wrong whisper in the right ear, and you'll be a joke by sunrise." Andrew's hands shook, but he forced himself to let go. He could not afford a public scene, not here, not tonight. Still, he felt the walls closing in. His mistress was no longer just a distraction, she was a threat. Back at the table, Hila's demeanor shifted. She laughed louder, leaned closer to powerful men, whispered jokes that excluded Andrew. She basked in attention, and Andrew could see the calculation in her eyes. She was testing her wings, wondering if she could fly without him. Andrew's fury simmered, but he pasted on his smile. He toasted investors, cracked jokes, pretended everything was under control. Yet every time he caught Emma's gaze across the room, the mask threatened to shatter. Her calm eyes seemed to pierce through him, reminding him of the night he left her, the cruel words he had thrown like knives. She had risen from those ashes, and he was sinking. During the final speech of the evening, Andrew leaned close to Hila. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Emma may think she's won tonight, but I'll remind her who she's dealing with." Hila didn't even look at him. She sipped her champagne, eyes scanning the room for more powerful prey. "You still don't get it, Andrew. Tonight isn't about reminding her. It's about surviving her." The words stung more than he wanted to admit. Survive her? Emma? The woman he had dismissed, belittled, thrown away? It was unthinkable. Yet as the night drew to a close, Andrew saw the truth etched in every whisper, every sideways glance, every camera flash that chose Emma over him. For the first time in his life, Andrew Weston wasn't the star of the show. He was the cautionary tale. And Hila, his supposed prize, was already plotting her escape. He clenched his fists, swore under his breath, and fixed his gaze on Emma one last time. Because if she thought tonight was her victory, she had no idea what he was willing to do to drag her back down. The gala had reached its golden peak. The orchestra swelled with a lively waltz, the chandeliers cast shimmering halos across the dance floor, and couples twirled in choreographed elegance. Laughter rose from clusters of glittering guests as champagne flutes clinked in endless toasts. To an outsider, the evening was flawless. But for Andrew Weston, the perfection was unbearable. Everywhere he turned, Emma's name echoed. He heard it on the lips of investors, murmured among socialites, whispered by journalists scribbling furiously into their notepads. Emma Weston, Emma and Ethan. Emma's vision, Emma's project. His hands curled into fists. This was supposed to be his night. His redemption after a week of scandal. Instead, the ex-wife he had discarded was rewriting the narrative of the city before his very eyes. Hila had grown distant as the evening progressed, more interested in mingling with men who commanded real power. Andrew watched her laugh too brightly at someone's joke, her hand lingering on another man's arm a moment too long. The sight gnawed at him, but not nearly as much as the sound of Emma's laughter across the ballroom. When Ethan leaned closer to whisper something into Emma's ear, and she smiled, calm, radiant, untouchable, Andrew's mask cracked. His chair screeched against the polished marble floor as he stood abruptly, drawing startled glances from nearby guests. "Andrew," Hila hissed, tugging at his sleeve. "Sit down, don't make a scene." But Andrew was past reason. The heat of humiliation burned through his veins, drowning out caution, drowning out logic. For years, he had been the master of every room he entered. Now, his power was slipping, and he needed to remind everyone, especially Emma, who he was. He strode across the dance floor, his shoes striking hard against the marble, his tuxedo jacket flaring behind him like a banner of war. Conversations stilled. Couples paused mid-step. By the time he reached Emma's table, silence had blanketed the ballroom. Emma looked up, startled but composed, as Andrew loomed over her. Ethan rose instinctively, his presence solid, protective, his eyes narrowed in warning. "Andrew," Emma said evenly, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "This isn't the time or the place," Andrew sneered. "Oh, I think it's exactly the time. And this," he gestured around at the glittering crowd, "is exactly the place. Everyone here should know the truth about you, Emma." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras snapped to attention, their flashes like gunfire. Ethan's voice cut like steel. "Walk away, Weston." But Andrew ignored him. His gaze was fixed on Emma, burning with venom. "You think you can waltz in here on Ethan Blackwell's arm and pretend you're somebody? You're nothing, Emma. You always were. You lived off my name, my success, my money. Without me, you'd still be sketching buildings no one wanted in some forgotten office. Don't stand here pretending you built anything." Emma's fingers tightened on the edge of the table, but she refused to flinch. The room around her blurred into whispers and sharp intakes of breath. Andrew's words were knives, but she would not let him see them pierce. Andrew pressed on, his voice rising, desperate. "Do you all know why she's here tonight? Because she married me. Because I gave her a platform. She's nothing but a bitter ex-wife trying to cling to relevance. And you," he stabbed a finger at Ethan, "you're only parading her around to humiliate me." The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Phones lifted, recording every word, broadcasting his rage live to the world beyond those golden walls. Hila appeared at Andrew's side, tugging his arm frantically. "Stop it! You're embarrassing yourself," she hissed, but he shook her off violently, nearly knocking her off balance. Emma rose slowly, the emerald silk of her gown catching the light, her face pale but resolute. "Enough," she said softly, yet the word carried like thunder. The silence that followed was electric. She looked directly at Andrew, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "You left me, Andrew. You left your wife while she carried your child. You left me in the rain with nothing but empty promises and broken vows. And now you stand here, trying to convince the world that I am nothing? Look around you." She swept her hand across the ballroom. "Does this look like nothing to you?" The audience held its breath. Andrew's face flushed red, his mouth opening, closing, struggling for words. Emma's voice, firm yet trembling with suppressed emotion, filled the space he had tried to claim. "I survived without you. I built without you. And I will continue to rise without you. The only thing you gave me was the chance to discover I was stronger than you ever believed." The applause began softly, one pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom thundered with clapping, cheers rising like a wave crashing against Andrew's pride. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing Emma's defiance, her transformation, her victory. Andrew stood frozen, his chest heaving, his face twisted in fury. Hila, sensing disaster, slipped quietly away from his side, her scarlet dress vanishing into the crowd. He shouted over the applause, his voice hoarse. "This isn't over, Emma. You'll regret this. All of you will regret siding with her." But the words sounded hollow, pathetic, swallowed by the roar of support for the woman he had once broken. Emma turned away from him, her hand slipping into Ethan's. Together they walked toward the stage, leaving Andrew stranded in the center of the ballroom, a man exposed, unraveling before hundreds of witnesses. He looked around desperately for an ally, for Hila, for anyone. But the investors averted their eyes. The socialites whispered behind jeweled hands. The journalists scribbled gleefully, their headlines already writing themselves. Andrew Weston, once the king of every room, had just been dethroned by the very woman he had called nothing. His chest tightened, rage mixing with humiliation until it felt like fire beneath his ribs. He wanted to lunge after her, to claw back the power slipping through his fingers, but his feet refused to move. He stood rooted, paralyzed, as Emma disappeared into the spotlight and the applause swallowed him whole. And in that devastating silence, Andrew realized the truth. Emma wasn't the one destroyed tonight. He was. The applause had faded, the chandeliers dimmed, and the ballroom slowly emptied into the midnight streets of Manhattan. Yet inside Emma, the echoes of that confrontation still thundered. She had stood her ground, faced Andrew's venom, and reclaimed her voice in front of the city's elite. But strength on display often hides the quiet collapse that comes after. Backstage, away from the cameras, Emma pressed her hands against a marble counter in the powder room, her breath uneven. The emerald silk of her gown suddenly felt like armor too heavy to wear. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman composed, regal even. But inside, the storm churned. She had not expected Andrew's cruelty to sting so sharply. His words, though hollow, had scraped against old wounds. "You're nothing. You lived off me. Without me, you'd have nothing." She had fought to prove him wrong, and she had succeeded. Yet why did her chest ache as though those lies still carried weight? The door creaked open. Ethan stepped in quietly, his presence filling the small room with calm. He didn't speak at first. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You handled yourself with dignity," he said softly. Emma exhaled shakily. "I thought I was ready. I told myself his words wouldn't matter anymore. But they did, Ethan. For a moment, it was like I was back there, pregnant, abandoned, begging him not to walk away, and the whole world was watching me break." Ethan turned her gently to face him. You didn't break. You stood taller than anyone else in that room. They saw the truth tonight, Emma. Not the version Andrew painted, not the lies he spread. You. Emma wanted to believe him, but when she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the past. Nights alone in their penthouse, phone calls unanswered, the cruel smirk when Andrew told her she was a burden. She saw herself packing boxes while 6 months pregnant, the whispers of pity from neighbors, the way lawyers had reduced her worth to numbers on a settlement page. The scars were deep, and tonight had ripped them open again. I don't know if I can keep doing this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Every time I take a step forward, it feels like he's still there, waiting to drag me back into the shadows. Ethan's gaze was steady, unwavering. That's what men like him want you to believe, that you'll never escape their shadow. But shadows only exist because of light. And tonight, Emma, you proved you are the light. Her throat tightened. For a moment she wanted to collapse into his arms, to let his strength hold her up. But pride kept her spine straight. She couldn't afford weakness, not now. Not when Andrew's eyes would still be hunting her in the dark. Later that night, back in her apartment, the silence pressed heavy against her. Lily was asleep in the next room, her tiny breaths soft and steady through the baby monitor. Emma sank into the couch, kicking off her heels, her body trembling with exhaustion. She switched on the television, and her own face filled the screen. News anchors dissected the confrontation, headlines scrolling across the bottom. Weston humiliated at gala, ex-wife emerges as rising power. Some commentators praised her courage, others speculated whether she was merely Ethan's latest project. Andrew's voice played in snippets, venomous and cruel, replayed endlessly for the world to consume. Emma muted the television, unable to bear it. The world saw her as strong, but the truth was simpler, raw. She was tired, bone-deep tired. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. He won't stop. Be careful. Emma's chest tightened. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who had sent it? Was it a warning from a friend or a threat from Andrew himself? Fear prickled at the back of her neck. She deleted the message, but the unease lingered. For the next hour, she sat in darkness, staring out the window at the city skyline. Her thoughts spiraled. What if Andrew tried to retaliate through the courts, dragging her into another legal battle? What if he used the media to smear her name again? What if he found a way to hurt Ethan's trust in her? Her composure cracked. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. She pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle the sobs, not wanting to wake Lily. She hated crying, hated that Andrew still had the power to make her feel this way. But in that moment she felt small, cornered, and desperately alone. A knock at the door startled her. She wiped her face quickly, pulling her robe tighter around her shoulders. Through the peephole she saw Ethan. He stood in the hallway, a quiet strength even in the dim light. She opened the door cautiously. "Ethan, it's late." "I know," he said, "but I couldn't leave you alone tonight. I've seen men like Andrew before. When their pride is wounded, they lash out. I won't let him hurt you again." His words were a balm, but also a reminder. The fight was far from over. Emma nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in silence for a while, the city lights flickering beyond the window. Finally, Emma whispered, "What if he destroys everything I've built? What if I can't protect Lily?" Ethan's expression softened. "Emma, listen to me. You've already survived the worst he could do. He abandoned you when you needed him most, and you rose from it. That strength is yours, and you're not alone anymore. You have me, you have allies, and you have the truth. He has nothing but lies, and lies eventually consume themselves." Emma swallowed hard, the knot in her chest loosening slightly. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe she was more than Andrew's shadow. But fear still coiled inside her, whispering doubts. When Ethan finally left, promising to call in the morning, Emma lay awake long after. She listened to Lily's soft breathing through the monitor, letting it steady her own. She closed her eyes and whispered a vow into the dark. "I will not let him win. Not again." Yet even as she drifted into restless sleep, Andrew's words haunted her dreams. His sneer, his rage, his promise. "This isn't over, Emma." And deep down she knew he meant it. For if tonight had been her triumph, tomorrow would bring his revenge. Morning sunlight spilled through the blinds, slicing the room into golden stripes. Emma stirred awake, her body heavy with the weight of the previous night. The confrontation replayed in her mind like a cruel film. Andrew's venom, the gasps of the crowd, the roar of applause that had drowned him out. She should have felt victorious, but instead her chest carried a tight ache, a reminder that battles leave bruises even when you win. Her phone buzzed. Messages flooded in. Congratulations, invitations, interviews. But one stood out, simple and chilling. He's digging. Be ready. Emma knew exactly what it meant. Andrew wasn't licking his wounds. He was already plotting. Later that morning, she arrived at her office downtown. Her small but elegant firm had grown quietly over the past 3 years, tucked into a renovated brownstone. Blueprints lined the walls, models of future projects stood proudly on display. Her employees greeted her with wide smiles, pride gleaming in their eyes after seeing her triumph splashed across every headline. But Emma's mind was already racing ahead. She knew Andrew wouldn't rest until he clawed back control. And she had a decision to make. Continue quietly or strike first. Ethan arrived not long after, his presence commanding even in the modest office. He laid a folder on her desk, his expression grave. He's contacting investors, spinning lies, claiming you're unstable, that you only have me propping you up. He wants to poison the well before your company takes off. Emma's hands tightened on the folder. The old fear prickled, but beneath it burned something sharper, anger. He always underestimated me. He thinks if he pulls away the spotlight, I'll crumble. But this time, I have something he doesn't know. Ethan studied her. Are you ready to use it? She nodded slowly. It's time. For years, Emma had hidden a secret. During her marriage, while Andrew squandered money on affairs and hollow ventures, Emma had quietly invested in properties under her maiden name. Small brownstones, undervalued lots, overlooked opportunities. At first it was survival, her way of ensuring Lily would never be left with nothing. But those small seeds had flourished. The portfolio had grown into a quiet empire, one even Andrew's lawyers had overlooked during the divorce. And now, with Ethan's backing, Emma was prepared to reveal it. That afternoon, she called a press conference. Journalists crammed into the modest lobby of her firm, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. The world expected a timid woman riding the coattails of a billionaire. Instead, they saw Emma Weston, confident, poised, stepping to the podium with quiet authority. Last night, she began, her voice clear, many of you witnessed an attempt to diminish me, to erase the truth of who I am and what I've built. Today, I want to set the record straight. I am not here because of my ex-husband. I am not here because of anyone's charity. I am here because of the work I've poured into this company, and because I believe in building a future stronger than the past we leave behind. She held up documents, her portfolio, her proof. These projects, these properties, these schools and homes, we did this. My team, my vision, my dedication, and we are only beginning. The room buzzed with questions, cameras snapping wildly. Headlines formed instantly. Emma Weston reveals hidden empire, not just Ethan's protege. Somewhere across the city, Andrew watched the broadcast in stunned silence. His hand trembled as he crushed a glass against the floor. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And worse, she had outsmarted him all along. But Emma wasn't finished. As for last night's accusations, she continued, her gaze steady on the cameras, let the record show. Strength is not built on cruelty, power is not built on betrayal, and dignity is not for sale. The press erupted in applause. Ethan, standing in the corner, gave the smallest nod, pride flickering in his eyes. Emma had just shifted the narrative entirely. When the conference ended, she returned to her office, exhausted but uplifted. Her employees hugged her, their cheers filling the air. For the first time in years, Emma felt not just strong, but invincible. But the war wasn't over. That evening, as the city lights blinked on one by one, Emma received another message. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a threat. You think you've won? Watch what happens next. Andrew's fury was escalating. His empire was crumbling, investors slipping through his fingers, and now the world knew his ex-wife had built something real while he drowned in deception. He would not go quietly. Yet Emma no longer trembled. She had revealed her secret, shown her cards, and the world had chosen to believe her. Still, as she tucked Lily into bed that night, Emma whispered a promise into the quiet room. No matter what he does, I will protect you. I will never let him break us again. The little girl stirred in her sleep, curling closer to her stuffed rabbit. Emma kissed her forehead, her heart heavy yet unyielding, because she knew Andrew Weston had just been cornered. And desperate men do desperate things. And what he planned next would test every ounce of strength Emma had left. The days following Emma's press conference unfolded like a storm, chaotic, relentless, but cleansing. Headlines screamed her name. Ex-wife no more. Emma Weston's empire emerges. From shadows to spotlight, the woman who outsmarted Andrew Weston. The narrative that had once cast her as the abandoned, broken wife had been rewritten, and this time Emma held the pen. Yet for Emma, the transformation was not just public, it was personal. For years, she had hidden behind modest clothes, small smiles, and cautious steps, fearful of standing too tall in a world that had once delighted in knocking her down. Now, she began to reclaim not only her voice, but her presence. One morning, she stood in front of the mirror, Lily playing at her feet. She studied her reflection with fresh eyes. The tired woman she had once been was gone. In her place stood someone who had endured betrayal, clawed through despair, and risen stronger. It wasn't just about looking powerful, it was about feeling it. Her stylist, a friend from her architecture days, helped her select a wardrobe that reflected who she had become. Sleek lines, bold colors, elegant but commanding. No longer muted, no longer invisible. At her next public meeting, she walked in wearing a tailored ivory suit, her hair swept back, her steps purposeful. Conversations halted, heads turned. She wasn't Andrew's ex-wife anymore. She was Emma Weston, in her own right. But Emma knew transformation wasn't only about appearance. It was about reclaiming her mindset. For too long she had believed Andrew's lies, that she was weak, dependent, nothing without him. Every scar from that marriage had whispered those doubts back into her mind. Now, she silenced them with action. She poured herself into her projects, meeting with community leaders, walking construction sites, shaking hands with the very people her work was meant to serve. She wasn't just building structures, she was building trust, hope, and a new future. The media began calling her the people's architect, a title she wore with pride. Ethan remained by her side, supportive but never overshadowing. "This is your time, Emma," he told her during one late-night strategy meeting. "The world is seeing what I've always known, that you are unstoppable." Her eyes softened at his words, but she didn't let herself lean too heavily on him. Ethan was an ally, yes, but this journey was hers to walk. She had to prove above all to herself that she could stand without anyone holding her up. Meanwhile, Andrew's decline was accelerating. His outbursts at the gala had gone viral, painting him as unhinged and bitter. Investors withdrew, partners canceled deals. Yila, sensing the sinking ship, slipped out of his life with a new benefactor, leaving him alone in his empty penthouse. Where Emma's transformation was a rebirth, his was a decay. And he knew it. One evening, Emma attended a charity dinner hosted by the mayor's office. The ballroom was filled with New York's most influential leaders. When she entered, the room shifted, not with pity, but with respect. She was introduced as the keynote speaker, her name met with applause that echoed through the gilded hall. As she stepped to the podium, Emma remembered every moment she had been told she was nothing, and with each word she spoke, she buried those lies deeper. "We live in a city of towers," she said, her voice steady, commanding. "But strength is not measured in glass and steel. It is measured in the hands that build, in the children who dream, in the women who rise even when the world tells them they cannot. I was told once that I had no worth beyond the man I stood beside. Tonight, I stand before you as proof that our worth is not given, it is claimed." The standing ovation was thunderous. Cameras flashed, capturing the glow of her transformation. In that moment, Emma wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every woman who had been silenced, dismissed, or betrayed. And the world listened. After the dinner, reporters swarmed her, asking if she had a message for Andrew. Emma smiled faintly, her eyes clear. "My message isn't for him. It's for anyone who has ever been told they are less than they are. Don't wait for permission to rise. Rise anyway." The clip aired nationwide, replayed on morning shows and talk segments. Emma had become more than a story. She was an icon. At home, though, her transformation was felt most deeply in the quiet moments. Tucking Lily into bed, Emma whispered promises with a heart no longer heavy with fear. She read her daughter bedtime stories about brave heroines, realizing she was living one herself. One night, as she watched Lily sleep, Ethan called. His voice was calm but tinged with warning. "Andrew isn't done. He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." Emma looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, her own reflection in the window beyond. For the first time, the thought of Andrew's threats didn't rattle her to her core. Instead, it steeled her resolve. "Let him try," she whispered. "I'm not afraid anymore." The words surprised her as much as they comforted her. She realized then that the true transformation wasn't in her clothes, her projects, or the applause of strangers. It was in her heart. Fear had ruled her once, chained her to Andrew's shadow. But fear no longer lived here. That night, she wrote in her journal, a habit she had abandoned during her marriage. Her pen moved with certainty. "I am not what he said I was. I am what I choose to be. And I choose to rise." By the end of the week, Emma's company announced a partnership with Ethan's firm that would secure her projects for the next decade. The press hailed it as a groundbreaking alliance. But privately, Ethan told her, "This is not my gift to you. This is your victory. You earned every inch of it." Emma smiled, tears threatening her eyes. She believed it now. And somewhere, alone in his crumbling empire, Andrew seethed. He had tried to paint her as nothing. Yet here she was, transformed into everything he feared. A woman who needed no one. A woman who commanded respect. A woman who could not be destroyed. And as Emma stood taller than ever, the stage was set for her final act. Not just survival, but justice. The Bright Horizons Gala had been the spark, but the Global Business Summit would be the fire. It was the most prestigious event of the year, a gathering where leaders from every industry came together to unveil projects, forge alliances, and display power. For Andrew Weston, it was his last chance to prove he still mattered. For Emma Weston, it was the stage for her final reckoning. The summit was held at the New York International Conference Center, its glass facade glittering like a jewel against the skyline. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with ambition. Cameras lined the entrance, capturing every arrival. CEOs, politicians, philanthropists, all were there. The energy was electric, thick with expectation. Andrew arrived alone. Yila had vanished weeks ago, lured by another benefactor, leaving him abandoned in both love and reputation. His tuxedo was immaculate, but his eyes were hollow, shadowed with sleepless nights and dwindling funds. He plastered on a smile, but the whispers followed him like smoke. "That's Weston. Didn't you see the video? He's unraveling." Still, Andrew had a plan. He intended to make a grand announcement, to unveil a project that would prove his power, silence the gossip, and eclipse Emma once and for all. He had bribed his way onto the speaking roster, desperate for one more chance at relevance. Emma, meanwhile, entered on Ethan Blackwell's arm, but tonight she didn't need his presence to validate her. Her tailored navy gown shimmered beneath the lights, her posture regal, her eyes steady. The crowd buzzed louder at her arrival than Andrew's. Journalists surged forward, snapping photos, asking questions about her projects. Emma answered gracefully, her words firm, her presence commanding. Inside the main hall, the stage was set with massive LED screens and sleek podiums. The audience of thousands took their seats, anticipation thick in the air. Andrew stepped onto the stage first. His voice boomed through the speakers, feigning confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I present the future of urban living, Weston Towers, a revolutionary development that will redefine our skyline." Images flashed on the screens, glossy renderings of skyscrapers, promises of innovation. He spoke of billions in investment, of bold vision. But behind the curtain of his words, the truth was grim. His finances were in shambles, the project a fabrication built on borrowed designs and empty contracts. The audience clapped politely, though the energy was thin. Andrew gripped the podium, sweat beading at his temples. He needed more. He needed to crush Emma publicly. And so, as if on cue, he turned his words toward her. "Of course," he sneered, "not everyone can innovate. Some ride the coattails of others, parading half-baked projects under the guise of charity. But real change requires leadership, not sentiment. Real power comes from men who know how to build." The jab was obvious. The crowd murmured, uneasy. Andrew smirked, emboldened. "Let us not confuse pity for progress. Some may be dazzled by emotional speeches, but sentiment does not build empires." He expected silence, maybe even agreement. Instead, the doors at the back of the hall opened and Emma walked in. The timing was flawless. All heads turned as she strode toward the stage, her heels echoing like a drumbeat of destiny. She climbed the steps calmly, the spotlight finding her. Andrew froze, his words caught in his throat. Emma faced the audience, her voice clear. "With respect, Mr. Weston is mistaken. Sentiment doesn't build empires, but neither do lies." Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras surged forward, recording every word. Emma held up a folder. "This," she said, "is proof that Weston Towers is a fabrication. These renderings were stolen from independent firms, and the contracts he boasts of don't exist. The so-called empire he speaks of is a crumbling illusion." The screens behind them flickered as Emma's team projected documents, emails, financial records, all exposing Andrew's fraud. The audience erupted in shock. Andrew lunged for the microphone. "This is slander. She's trying to destroy me because she's bitter." Emma stepped closer, her voice cutting like a blade. "No, Andrew, I'm not bitter. I'm free, and I will not let you deceive this city the way you deceived me." The applause that followed was deafening. Ethan joined her on stage, standing solidly at her side. "Everything you've seen has been verified. Emma Weston is the architect of a real future. Andrew Weston is the architect of lies." Security began to approach Andrew, whispers spreading like wildfire. Reporters shouted questions. "Is it true? Did you falsify documents? Did you steal designs?" Andrew's face twisted with rage. He pointed at Emma, his voice cracking. "You think you've beaten me? You were nothing without me." Emma looked at him, calm, unflinching. "You're right, Andrew. I was nothing without you, but without you, I became everything." The hall erupted in cheers, the thunder of applause shaking the very walls. Cameras flashed, capturing the exact moment Andrew Weston was publicly destroyed by the woman he once discarded. Security escorted him off the stage, his protests drowned out by the roar of triumph around Emma. He was no longer the king. He was the fool, undone by his own arrogance. Emma stood tall, the spotlight bathing her in gold. She had not just survived, she had won. And for the first time, Andrew realized his greatest mistake wasn't leaving her. It was underestimating her. The fallout from the Global Business Summit rippled through the city like an earthquake. By sunrise, every news outlet carried the same story. Andrew Weston exposed, ex-wife triumphs in stunning showdown. Video clips of Emma's calm words, her damning evidence, and Andrew's desperate collapse flooded social media. Within hours, his remaining investors fled, his company's stock plummeted, and lawsuits piled at his doorstep. By the end of the week, Andrew Weston was no longer a titan of industry. He was a disgraced cautionary tale, his name synonymous with fraud and betrayal. Paparazzi hounded him not to capture his power, but to record his humiliation. And in the silence of his now empty penthouse, he finally understood the weight of everything he had lost, not just wealth, not just reputation, but the woman who had proven herself stronger than he had ever imagined. Emma, meanwhile, found herself in the opposite position. Her face graced magazine covers, not as a scandalized ex-wife but as a visionary leader. She was invited to panels, interviewed on national television, praised as a voice of resilience. Yet behind the headlines, Emma focused on what mattered most. She returned to her office, rolled up her sleeves, and poured her energy into the projects that had always been her true passion. Schools, homes, spaces designed to heal and inspire. But the transformation wasn't only external. Inside, Emma felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The confrontation with Andrew had been terrifying, yes, but it had also set her free. No longer did his words echo in her mind like chains. No longer did she carry the weight of proving herself worthy. She had faced him, unflinching, and emerged whole. One afternoon, she stood at a construction site where one of her new schools was rising from the ground. The air was filled with the clang of steel, the hum of machinery, the laughter of children from a nearby playground. Ethan walked beside her, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, the dust of the site settling in his dark hair. "They'll remember this more than any speech," he said, watching the beams being hoisted into place. "Not the gala, not the summit, this, what you're building." Emma smiled, her heart warm. "That's the point. Legacy isn't made in ballrooms, it's made in places like this." He looked at her then, his gaze steady, filled with something deeper than admiration. "Emma, I hope you know, you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. She held his gaze for a long moment. In Ethan, she saw not a savior but a partner, someone who respected her strength rather than feared it. The thought of love had once terrified her, the memory of betrayal too raw, but now, slowly, she allowed herself to imagine it again. Not as dependency, not as surrender, but as a choice made in freedom. That evening Emma returned home to Lily. The little girl ran into her arms, her laughter like music, her small hands clutching Emma's cheeks. "Mommy, you're home." Emma knelt, holding her close, breathing in the scent of crayons and shampoo. "Always, sweetheart," she whispered, "always." As she tucked Lily into bed, Emma told her a story, not of castles or princesses, but of a woman who had once been told she was nothing, and who rose to become everything. Lily's eyes grew wide with wonder. "Was she scared, Mommy?" Emma brushed a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Yes, baby, she was scared. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going anyway." The little girl yawned, snuggling into her pillow. "Then I'll be brave too." Tears filled Emma's eyes as she kissed her daughter goodnight. In that moment, she knew the fight had never just been about her. It had been for Lily, for every future where her daughter would never doubt her own worth. Days turned into weeks, and Andrew faded further into obscurity. Occasionally his name surfaced in reports of lawsuits or debts, but no one cared anymore. He had become irrelevant, his power stripped away. Emma never spoke of him again, not out of fear, but because he no longer deserved space in her story. At a gala months later, this time honoring her for her contributions to education, Emma stood on stage in front of a crowd that rose to its feet. She looked out over the sea of faces, some powerful, some ordinary, all united in admiration. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the rain-soaked night of abandonment, the whispered pity, the tears cried alone. And then she thought of the woman she had become, standing tall in her own light. Her speech was simple, heartfelt. "I once believed my worth was tied to someone else's success. I once believed I was powerless without the man beside me. But I was wrong. Our strength is not given, it is discovered, often in the hardest of times. Tonight, I don't stand here as someone's ex-wife. I stand here as proof that no betrayal, no abandonment, no cruelty can erase who we are meant to be. To every woman who has ever been told you are nothing, remember, you are everything." The applause was thunderous, some in tears, others standing on chairs to cheer. Ethan clapped the loudest, pride radiating from him. When Emma stepped off the stage, she didn't feel like a survivor anymore. She felt like a victor. Not because Andrew had fallen, but because she had risen. That night, as the city glittered outside her window, Emma sat with Lily in her lap, reading her a story. Ethan lingered nearby, his quiet presence a steady warmth. Emma looked around, at her daughter, at her work, at her newfound peace, and knew the truth. The story was no longer about Andrew. It was no longer about betrayal. It was about rebuilding, reclaiming, and rising higher than she had ever dreamed. And as the night wrapped around them, Emma Weston whispered to herself the words she had fought so hard to believe. "I am not broken. I am whole, and I am free." So that's the end of Emma's story, my wonderful friends. And if you're still here with me right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart in a very real way. You see, Emma's path reminds us of a truth the Stoics often spoke of. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. Seneca. Pain, betrayal, loss, these are not the end, but the forge where strength is shaped. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "What stands in the way becomes the way." And just like Emma, we can turn every wound into wisdom, every ending into a beginning. So let this story be a mirror. If life has ever told you that you are nothing, remember, you are everything. You are worthy, strong, and free. If you felt even a spark of hope tonight, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs strength, and